Okay, so we promised we would talk about some European Valorant, and the obvious team we should discuss is the one you referred to. It's G2, obviously, because G2 has brought back the ever-popular Mixwell's back in the lineup. He's no longer inactive. So give me some thoughts. And what about the current G2? Obviously, once upon a time, you have to go back a while now, they were once upon a time a contender for the best team.
Yeah, G2 had a kind of interesting story last year because they sort of did a bit of a rebuild in the middle of the year. So this was around the time that I started casting Valorant, and there was like a famous switch between a player between like them and Ascend. So Zeke went to Ascend, Coldamenta came over to G2, and obviously Ascend then just ascended. You know, they did really well, became world champions. Great, good for Zeke. He really won out in that one. Meanwhile, Coldamenta is no longer on G2. And G2 were doing pretty well in stage 3, and then they were doing good at Masters 3, but they went out in the semifinals. So they didn't quite get to where I think people felt they could have. I mean, obviously only a really limited number of teams can get beyond that, but I think people felt there should have been like an extra bit of push in there. And then for this year, keloqz was on the inactive roster and Mixwell was on the active roster, and he was their IGL and he was taking the duelist spot, blah, 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 blah. And then they failed to qualify in the first open qualifiers. And they were like, Mixwell, you're fucking out. keloqz, you're in. And that was already like, okay, you know, cool. And a lot of people were quite excited by it because people find keloqz an exciting player. keloqz was someone who, so at Masters, like people didn't know a ton about him before Masters 3. And then he was one of those players who like his whole personality came through when he was on stage. He was really like going for it, very animated. He was so much fun to watch. In my opinion, he's a better duelist than Mixwell, and he's more fun a duelist to watch than Mixwell. And so getting to just like as an entertainment factor, he's really great. So a lot of people were like, oh cool, we get to like watch him again. And obviously Mixwell has like a lot of fans, as you say, like he's popular. So it was a very contentious thing. And then something like 2 weeks into the stage, G2 have now announced that Mixwell is back in, and keloqz is not just on the inactive roster, but he's gone. And it's like, what? Like, Carlos, chill. Like, you know, he already did what he did to the League of Legends roster. You got to stop blowing all these rosters up. And I just, it's kind of confused. There was some stuff that came out that it was like, oh, it's because Nukier, who if I'm not mistaken, and I'm gonna say this very tentatively, I think he then picked up the IGL role after Mixwell initially left. But it's something like Nukier and keloqz didn't get on or something. That was like what was going around. I've said this on my own channel. I don't really care for player drama, so frankly, I don't give a shit who hates whom. I know you said that you like to ask players that, but like it just, you know, I went to all girls school for 7 years. I'm done with that shit. But there was something to do with 2 players on the roster not necessarily wanting to play simultaneously. So I think that was part of the reason why this was even happening in the first place. But anyway, G2, yeah, they've now dropped keloqz, and within like an hour Heretics announced that they're picking him up. And like Heretics are a fine team, but they're not actually in VCT EU right now, and so I'm interested to see what keloqz can achieve on that roster. I like in one of my videos I made some like crude comparison to like Reckless joining K-Corp and it being like, okay, everyone thinks this is a downgrade, but like maybe it's actually just people are gonna follow you there. So I'm intrigued to know what's gonna happen there, because they're not in I nearly said because they're not in the LEC. Yeah, no,
they're not in the VCT, obviously. Yeah. If people don't know, Heretics is basically like a smaller French org in esports, so they're not big.
Well, they're Spanish.
Oh, sorry, then maybe they're Spanish then. No, I mean where the org's based. I think the org's French, isn't it?
In VCT, it's a predominantly Spanish team, but given the fact that like fucking in CS, NIP are like Swedish, and in Rainbow Six they're Brazilian. I can't keep up with like.
No, I just mean more that it's not an enormous esports org. In case people are wondering. So like the comparison is probably apt because basically the premise here is like maybe Kellogg's gets to be like a big fish in a small pond. Like obviously Reckless is, because if people don't know, in League of Legends, Reckless is like incredibly overqualified to be in what's essentially like tier 2 competition within his region. He essentially should be in the top one. Right, here's the question though. You already touched on it before. Does that mean then, with the sort of musical chairs they played with the roster, does that mean even though Mixwell is back, he's now not the IGL anymore, he's just the duelist? Did they keep Nokia as the IGL? That's my question. Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that question. My assumption would be that it would be handed back to Mixwell, because that's kind of what his job always was. Like when they rebuilt G2 last year, if I remember correctly, he was the remaining player from what they'd kind of blown up, and they built around him.
He's basically Carlos's boy, if people don't know. Like, he's the guy he's definitely sort of got a connection with.
Yes. So I like, given that the whole like vision of G2 was to have him as like this centerpiece, like I would assume it would go back to him. But I in everything I have read, I have not seen it stated anywhere. So that doesn't necessarily mean it's not public knowledge. It just means I haven't seen it.
Yes.
But I'm curious, and again, I'm gonna like repeat what I fucking said about 100 Thieves. But like, okay, you've made your bed now. You've picked your roster. Please just stay there. Just stay there for a bit, like one stage. You know, like just develop your roster, please. You know. So I hope that, you know, now they've resolved whatever it is I'm glad that they let Kellogg's go. I think that's the biggest thing. My biggest takeaway from this, I'm glad that they actually let Kellogg's go elsewhere. Because I would hate to see both of these players get fucked around by constantly being in and out. But B, I would hate to see a player get benched and then not have the opportunity to go and find something elsewhere and still be able to develop themselves and build themselves, even if it's outside of this specific team.
Yeah, by the way, one thing, if people don't know G2 beyond this particular game, expect this to continue, though, as a general trend, because if people don't know, one of the interesting things about Carlos is even though as an actual human, he does normally pick a player in each team that he has a very close relationship, and, you know, while they're still, like, good player, competent at the game, he will often, like, you know, basically, they sort of get to advise him on what they do. I will say, he will even openly say he is very cutthroat if he thinks the roster can't win, though. Like, if people want an analogy, in CSGO, his team literally was in the final of the last World Championship, and he still cut 2 of the players from the team. And by the way, it was the right move. Like, actually, it was an upgrade. He wanted to win. So essentially, he's not the guy going on the other angle of like, oh, keep this guy because he's a community favourite. Like, the premise here, and fair play, he's lived up to it, is this beloved player's fucking Mixwell. He even benched him. So I agree with you. It's certainly possible you can go too far the other way, and like, you can't cut a player after every bad result. Like, you have to eventually build something. I agree. But yeah, I would expect this will be a team that will be fairly brutal within this regard. I mean, you look at the Wikipedia for the G2 squad, man alive, he's got everyone pretty much. Like, they had some really big names at the beginning of Valorant as well. Just one by one, they all just went out the door. It's funny because I was talking to someone about this the other day, and like, I have actually never spoken to Carlos. I don't know him like on a personal level, but I was talking to someone, and I was like, man, like, you know, this keeps happening with G2. Like, it's become a bit of a meme. And they were like, yeah, well, it's very like emotionally led. Like, he's very invested in what is happening with the teams. And so like, he will be really cutthroat about things because he is like emotionally into that. And I was like, all right, cool. That's the Carlos analysis that I had from whoever the fuck it was I was talking to. So, I mean, yeah, it just reminds me of the whole controversy about, what was it? It was something in League of Legends where, like, he had it written into their contract that they couldn't go to Fnatic, or, like, so, like, who? No, here's the thing you have to realise. He was just a master. He really was the guy who was playing chess and they were all playing checkers. He did stuff like this, Gio. It's fucking sick. He not only wouldn't let his greatest player ever go to his direct rival. He did have this guy in the contract, to be fair. It's not like the guy was a free agent. He not only didn't allow him to go, but then, yeah, as you say, when he sold him to a different team, he sold him to NA. He was in EU. He sold him to at NA, so he wasn't even competition. And then he wrote a clause in the contract that said, if during this contract he leaves NA, he can't then just go directly to my rival in Europe, who I didn't want to sell to in the first place. So he actually was like mad Machiavellian in that regard, yeah.
I saw like
the best part is, it's because the reason is, they only found this clause like when the player decided to move again. Like no one sort of checked into this and were like, so yeah, the joke is it's like he was like, I'd check your contract, and they're like, fuck, it's in there, like, and he really had like snuck a clause in that was like, he cannot go to Fnatic. No. Oh, genius in a way. Like, listen, if you wanted to be like a villain and run the seats, genius, yeah. That's how you do it. Yeah.
But it does like come back to that same thing that people frequently remind people of on social media, which is if you're a player, get someone to read your contract.
Absolutely.
If you're talent, do it as well. Like be represented by someone, even if it's just a lawyer you hire. Like don't sign contracts without reading them.
That's why, exactly. That is exactly. I've got a question for you, though. You alluded to earlier that obviously, typically, the duelist role isn't the role you want your in-game leader to be in, right? I mean, the role, as you're describing them all, it makes a lot more sense, as you said, with some of those, like the chamber guy, it makes a lot more sense. Someone like that would be the IGL, right? What does that, like, how was Mixwell doing it in that regard? Because, again, that's another trait that carries over to CS. Like, typically, if you're like the superstar player, you're almost never the in-game leader, because the premise goes, there's only so much brain attention, and the idea is, like, do I want to be spending it talking to you, setting up, visualizing what you're doing on the map, or am I focused on my crosshair? You know, it's kind of the division of labour in CS to some degree. So, how was Mixwell actually playing that role as an IGL? How did he make it work?
Yeah,
I mean, maybe as a case, maybe.
That's a really good question. I mean, again, obviously, I don't know what his calls were like within the game, but what I can see is the results of what it was, and that is in stage 3 when I was casting EU, G2 were doing pretty well. And like at the end of the day, I wish I had more insight in it than that, to be perfectly honest with you, because it's not the most common thing in the world for that to be the case. And I think if I were building a team, obviously it really depends on who's on the team, but if I were building the team, I would choose to not have that as the in-game leader. And actually, I was just looking at their Wikipedia page just to see, and it still says that Nukier is the in-game leader.
Right.
So it could be that he is going to be staying as that. So I don't know. And I mean, like in the past, like Coldmenter was the in-game leader. So I mean, and he was on there in stage 3. So they've had a lot of changes in their IGL. And maybe it was just that for most of stage 3, it was just Coldmenter, and it was only switched over to Mixwell at the start of this year. At the start of this year, when given that I'm not on VCT EU anymore, I haven't been as focused on what's going on within Europe as much as I have with NA. So they've changed their IGLs quite a few times, which, to be perfectly honest with you, could be an entire discussion of its own right.
Of course.
Right? In terms of like, is that conducive to really building something? But so I don't know if they're going to switch it back to Mixwell. They might leave it on Nukier. And to add to that, at least in the time when I was casting EU, Nukier was also playing Duelist, but he was more like the secondary Duelist role. So you would see him on someone like Raze, for example. And a lot of teams don't necessarily play double Duelist as much as they did before. So he's not always, like, it's not the same as being a Jet player, for example. But it is still in that region. It's more towards that end than the support end.
Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.